I'm Steve Cheney. I'm the CEO of the American Security Project. And for those not familiar with ASP, we're a 501c3 nonprofit established in 2006 by Senators Kerry, Hart, Hagel, and Rudman. And the intent behind ASP was to take on topical issues that perhaps got slanted one way or the other, and that we would educate folks on these issues. And we've got a number of them that we're big into: energy security, climate change, nuclear security, to name a few. And lately we have branched into public diplomacy with Matthew Wallen, who's our fellow on public diplomacy. So it's kind of a new area for us, but we think a particularly important one. When you look back on my board, it's been a tumultuous couple of weeks for us, losing both Kerry and Hagel, but they're in pretty good spots to support us and the work that we do. And indeed, if you look back at our website and see what they've signed up to, you can get kind of an idea of some of the things that are going to be on both their agendas at state and defense. But that's not why we're here today, and I kind of like the topic that Matthew laid out here, improving relations on Earth by exploring space. You need to go to Capitol Hill and we can fix them up there. We're trying hard. And we've got two very distinguished guests. Matthew's going to introduce them here in a minute. We're appreciative that you both came. Familiar with NASA, of course, and your association as well, Vaughan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew Wallen, who's our fellow for public diplomacy.
Thank you, Steve. Glad to see everyone here. It's a unique subject that we're approaching here at ASP, and one that's relatively new for us. Public diplomacy for ASP is something that we view as a national security issue. It's primarily about influencing audiences overseas and building relationships with those audiences. It's about the American message, which is carried out not only in narrative, but in actions as well. And the things that NASA and our scientists do are a primary example of that. The proper use of public diplomacy allows the U.S. to better craft policy and achieve its foreign policy objectives by establishing and maintaining these trust relationships overseas. Sometimes they're with allies, sometimes they're with nations that we're slightly less friendly with. But while the U.S. has had notable difficulties in influencing certain foreign audiences, it has maintained certain advantages over the years. Polling and research studies in recent years have continuously seen science and technology ranked as one of America's greatest assets. It's really about soft power, that is, the power to attract rather than to coerce. At the forefront of these American scientific efforts, we often find NASA. But while landing on the moon and teaching the world more about itself through projects like the Hubble Space Telescope over the years are inspiring, NASA has also been a leader in diplomatic efforts overseas. So we have two guests here today. On my right we have Kent G. Bress. Kent is the director of the Aeronautics and Cross-Agency Support Division at the Office of International Interagency Relations at NASA headquarters in DC here. He served in that office since '93 and has been a division director since 2007. In his current position, he oversees NASA's collaboration with Europe and Canada and supervises the negotiation of international agreements in the areas of aeronautics, space technology, education, and public outreach. From '97 to '99, he was NASA's representative in Moscow, Russia. On my far right is Dr. Vaughan Turekian. He is the Chief International Officer for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, right next door. He's also the director of AAAS's Center for Science Diplomacy and the editor-in-chief of Science and Diplomacy magazine, a quarterly publication that the Center puts out. Dr. Turekian has served as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, where he was a lead advisor on international science, technology, environment and health issues, including clean energy, sustainable development, climate change, which is an area ASP focuses in specifically, as well as scientific outreach and avian flu. He's a two-time recipient of the Department Superior Honor Award for his work on climate change and avian flu. And with that, I'd like to start with Dr. Turekian.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Steve, for hosting us here today. And it's a pleasure to get an opportunity to chat a little bit, and I'll give sort of the broad overview of science diplomacy, the way that we think about it, but really it's interesting when we think about mixing science diplomacy and public diplomacy, because I think that we have to think about it both in terms of what it can do, but also a little bit carefully. So early on, I read a lot of these same polling data that everyone looked at and saw other people saying, look, there are parts of the world where people just don't like the United States. But in every one of those places, the respect and admiration for U.S. science remains extremely high. And if you want, I'm losing the big mics. It's okay. Story of my life. But what ends up happening oftentimes is that we look at those statistics and we say, you know what that means? Man, if we just throw more science at things, people are going to like us better. Kind of, but not really. And that's where we have to be a little bit careful when we think about science diplomacy. Science diplomacy fundamentally starts with the science. Fundamentally, for us to use, the US to use science as a way to attract, to do other things, requires that the science that we put behind it, things that NASA does, many of our agencies, most of our universities, lots of our institutes do, are fundamentally underpinned by the best science, a well-funded scientific regime that's always served as the way to bring people in and to really get access to the top talent. One can only look around this room to see the diversity in the United States in terms of people interested in issues around science and technology. And it's growing more and more. The caveat I'll make about science diplomacy, though, is that while it has a link to public diplomacy, it shouldn't be viewed as the panacea. That if you go to places where people don't like the United States or don't like US policy, that if you put more science at the problem, people are going to suddenly switch their views. No, what ends up happening actually in reality is people, whether they're in the United States or anywhere or any topic, do a very good job of differentiating and categorizing and cataloging their different pieces. What we think about more and more is this issue that I think about with somebody like learning golf. I'm not a golfer, but if I were to learn golf, somebody were to say to me, what do you think about Tiger Woods as a person? And I'd say, I don't know, he seems sort of like a jerk, right? But somebody said to me, whom do you want to learn golf from? I'd say, I'd love to learn from Tiger Woods. He's the best there is. That is not totally different from the way in which a lot of the world thinks about the United States vis-a-vis science. When people look at the United States with science, they go, I might not like everything about it. I might have differences in all their different opinions of what they should do in terms of governments and other things. But man, when I look at their science, they're the best in the world. And that's who I want to model myself on. That actually has a much longer term impact on the way that the United States is able to engage with the world. Because what that does is it actually attracts people to our universities and our institutes and all those places I mentioned before to learn the scientific method, to learn things that we take for granted, that the lingua franca of the world is actually English, because the top people around the world, and the top educated people are actually speaking English. Top leadership is speaking English, because many, if not most of them, have actually spent some time in the United States. There's great advantages to the conduct of US foreign policy, because science has been an attractor. Again, it starts with, I think in everyone's view, the fact that scientific expertise is really sort of considered paramount and one of the best. What's happening now, and it's changing, and it'll be interesting to hear sort of a NASA perspective on this as well, is that, and you actually see it with things like China launching more things to the moon and other things, that lead may be eroding a little bit for lots of reasons, or other countries are also placing great emphasis on science. So what happened is, for a very long period of time, the US was the filter feeder. It got the best science coming into it, the best scientists, and always had access to it. Now, as more and more nodes of science are being set up around the world, to get access to that science, we have to be a little bit more of a predator, which means we have to do a better job of reaching out to those places overseas where great science is taking place. And that means, just by definition, an internationalization of almost everything that the scientific enterprise does. The result is actually that the US then has great access and great opportunities, but also has to deal with the things that now deal with the conduct of science. And this is where science diplomacy and public diplomacy are so important. We, through being excellent in science and admired in science, have written many of the rules of the scientific enterprise. The way peer review, transparency, meritocracy, all things that actually are really, really important, not only to science, but the way in which societies function. So we've benefited, and now we're sort of going to get more benefit from the fact that many of the top world leaders in science have been trained in the United States. And as we now reach out, we are again speaking not only common language, but we're also doing it from the standpoint of a common set of values and approaches. So I think with that, I'm going to end, because I think we'll leave more time for questions at the end. But thanks very much. Go ahead.
Well, Vaughan, that was an absolutely great introduction, because you touched on a lot of the same things that I think I had meant to bring up at some point during my discussion here. And the fact that in a way which you've said has allowed me to say a little bit more easily an explanation for why it is that NASA maybe didn't go out with the intention to perform public diplomacy, but in the end we wound up doing it. And it's because of what you said, it starts with the science. It starts with being the best, right? So NASA, as you'll see, is all about the mission. It's all about human spaceflight, space science, earth science, aeronautics, space technology. And we strive to be the very best at these things, and by that we bring partners to us. And in that process, over the years, you start establishing a lingua franca, not just English, but also exactly what Vaughan just talked about. The shared values that we have as scientists around the world on things like peer review and transparency, even down to the processes that we go through for our missions. You know, we'll walk into a new partnership with a country like India and find that when they explain their engineering processes to us, we're looking at our own processes because they have been with us in our institutes and research agencies for a long time, and we've just sort of set that. So that's a really unique way that you can achieve soft power, achieve public diplomacy. And if you ask the people who are doing it, they'd be like me. They'd have to go back to Wikipedia and look up the meaning of the words. So with that, let me just, since you've got a person from NASA here, let me just spend like 5 minutes talking about what NASA priorities are. We are a government agency, of course. We're funded currently at around $17 billion. And our main missions are the things I just mentioned: human spaceflight, space science, earth science, aeronautics, space technology development. Right now, if someone were to ask me what our top priorities were, I wouldn't have to guess because I've been told that they are the development of a new rocket, new heavy lift launch vehicle called the Space Launch System, the development of a spacecraft called the Multi-Purpose Crew Vehicle, or Orion. By the way, my son's named Orion, but we had the name first, right? So, both parents are NASA geeks, so that happens. And so these new spacecraft, we're also operating the International Space Station, and part of that is developing a new generation of vehicles to take cargo and crew to the space station. And you just saw we had a bit of a nail biter over the weekend. SpaceX, a company, private company, succeeded in taking a spacecraft up to the station. It's there now. And then the other thing that's a main priority for us is the completion of the James Webb Space Telescope. You know, an agency that's got 93 space missions in some stage from formulation to end of life, and has got multiple programs in other fields, you got to have priorities, and those are ours right now. At the same time, we're doing a lot of other stuff too. We're focusing on, now that we've built the International Space Station, we're focusing on getting some scientific use out of it. We're working to better understand and protect our planet through multiple, I think the last time I counted there were 18 that still are operating Earth science missions. We are trying to characterize the threat to Earth that asteroids might pose. We're continuing to explore Mars, and we are exploring the solar system and beyond with new missions, including a mission to an asteroid. So it's an extremely cool time to be working at NASA. I've been there since 1990, and yeah, every day is fascinating. So with that, let me move on. Next slide. Since I've been asked to talk about NASA and public diplomacy, not just our international cooperation, the presentation that I've put together is going to be a little bit different from any of the ones that I've done before, than the ones we typically give to our industry partners or foreign partners. It's not one that actually has been approved by my boss, so if no one sees the YouTube on this, don't go tell him, right? But I'm winged it a little bit. Talking about public diplomacy is a bit of a new thing for a bureaucrat in a technical agency like me. And so one thing that I'm looking forward to from Matt, from the audience, is I would appreciate your feedback and input and helping us think of new ways to think about public diplomacy. I'm going to leave you with a couple of points, and one of which is something that I think Vaughan and I derived from what Vaughan said, is that the conduct of public diplomacy by a technical agency sometimes is intentional and can also be unintentional. And the other takeaway that I wanted to leave is that there are multiple sort of levels through which public diplomacy is being exerted through NASA. And not all of them involve international cooperation in what we would call traditional sense. But to start with, if you could hit the next slide, please. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on comfortable ground, and then I'll try to go into a little bit about the various levels of public diplomacy. So, I mentioned before, I was kind of joking about Wikipedia, but not really. My office, I work for the Office of International Interagency Relations at NASA headquarters. And international relations at NASA is a corporate function, which is to say that even though we have 10 field centers that are scattered around the country, the policies for international cooperation are set and maintained at headquarters. And our office sort of oversees all that. And so the things that we wind up doing, when you're in the grand scheme of public diplomacy, may seem rather mundane. We write the agreements that describe the cooperation. When senior officials go overseas or when they receive their counterparts from foreign countries, we're the ones who staff the meetings and prepare all the meeting notes and make sure that the coffee is hot and everything else. And then we provide guidance on actual foreign policy, the external conditions, sort of the limits within which our cooperation can take place. We help to inform, educate, interpret, and provide guidance on those policies to the people at the field centers, the technical scientists and engineers who are actually carrying out our cooperation. We're not really, what I'm trying to say is that we're not diplomats, and we're not really the outreach people, although they're the ones who made sure that I mentioned all those things that Tess is doing at the beginning of the conversation. So we do talk sometimes. The topic of public diplomacy, though, is something we don't usually deal with in my office, and so I was sent to look up the definitions. So, and I believe, yeah, so you'll see the behind. I understand that there's been a sort of a transition to maybe a broader understanding of what the concept means. And the one that I found sort of spoke to me a little bit was the one from Jill Schuker, who defines it as effectively communicating with publics around the world to understand, value, and even emulate Americans' visions and ideas. The idea of coming to share common values, especially in the scientific area, I think that is critically important. And again, we'll talk about that, but I think what Vaughan said totally nailed it again. It starts with the science. So, next question. So NASA was created in 1958, as you know, for a variety of reasons, but primarily it was created to meet the challenge of the Soviet Union. So in a way, it was foreign policy right from the get-go. And the values that sort of define NASA are written right down in the Space Act that created us in 1958. And they reflect kind of a mix of values that range from both the lofty to the more mundane. And by lofty, I mean, here's a government agency that is being charged with reaching for the stars, you know, and from right from the beginning saying, what NASA learns about the universe will be shared with all mankind. So that's lofty ideals. What it created, though, was a scientific research, technology development government agency. By the way, I think that might be a conceit, but I think this idea that this agency must go out and share everything that it learns about the universe with the public may be uniquely American, and it may reflect, you know, as it was a country at the height of its power, you know, confident and self-assured.